Harper launches a major termination plan, First Nations termination plan, and that's available on the internet. I also did Canada's War on First Nations. That's like a PowerPoint, more of a historical thing, going back from the Doctrine of Discovery right through to the Indian Act, the treaties in the Indian Act up till today. So if anybody wants to look at that, Roger probably has that. And the last thing I did, I was concerned about this I Don't Know More movement, being kind of shallow in their analysis from what I've been seeing in the media. So I did, my stepdaughter is an actress and producer, Jennifer Podemsky, and she interviewed me and put it up on YouTube. So there's a video of a longer talk I give, which you can get off the internet too. But all three of those materials I put out to help give more background information to people just getting involved into the political situation today. I noticed a lot of young people, so I know a lot of them don't have the historical background. So that's why I did those three things recently. But what Roger's asked me to talk about, I guess, is to summarize what I wrote in my article. And basically what I wrote in the article, I'm covering basically the past 40 years of what's gone on from the 1969 White Paper, when Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister and John Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs. They had a white paper in Indian policy where they proposed a number of measures basically to assimilate Indians and to terminate their rights, and that was get rid of the treaties, get rid of the reserves, repeal the Indian Act, amend the Constitution to remove any references to Indians and Indian lands. There was a number of measures in there. And of course, First Nations, Indian people across Canada rose up and rejected that, and the government, that's when the Indians of Alberta Association presented the Red Paper in 1971 to Trudeau and them. And publicly, they said they weren't going to push the White Paper, but, we've got documents internally from the bureaucracy saying, well, they're just going to extend the time frame, because they were proposing to do that within 5 years. So what they did was they extended the time frame. So the bureaucracy has still been implementing the White Paper, but they've been doing it in components rather than as a whole, like trying to change the legal and political status of Indians. And so, throughout the 70s, there was some talk of amending the Indian Act, but the National Indian Brotherhood at the time, didn't accept that. They had some strong leaders at the time, George Manuel, also from Saskatchewan. I'm getting old here. Noel Starblanket was pretty strong too, and so in the 70s, the Trudeau government didn't push too hard. And then, of course, in 1980, Trudeau proposed patriating Canada's Constitution, and that led us into the whole fight, about being included in the Constitution or not being included, because there was a debate about that amongst different leaders and First Nations across Canada. In the end, Section 35 was put in the Constitution, and there were some treaty nations and some from BC that went and fought against it in England in court too, but they lost. But when the court decision came down, they said Canada could patriate the Constitution, but they had to respect the treaties as long as the promises in the treaties, as long as the sun shines and the grass grows. And that was Justice Denning that handed down that decision in England. And so, some of you are probably old enough to remember the constitutional talks in the 80s, and that was supposed to define what Aboriginal treaty rights were in the meaning of Section 35 in the Constitution. But those talks ended in failure because, by 1987, that was the last meeting, and Mulroney, the meeting ended and he didn't, move to create any more meetings. He was already in secret talks with Premier Bourassa to develop what became the Meech Lake Accord. And they were focusing on Quebec's distinct society and ignoring First Nations issues then, in terms of constitutional reform. But, we saw what happened in 1990. That's when the so-called Oka crisis happened. My reserve, Ganawagi, blocked the Mercier Bridge after a SWAT team attacked our sister community, Gunnesadage, for an expansion of a golf course to our community over there near burial ground. and 100-year-old stand of white pines that our people had planted. And that led to a 78-day standoff. And coming out of that standoff, Moroney announced 4 pillars to a policy where he announced what would become the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. He said he would accelerate the settlement of native claims and that he would improve, the socioeconomic conditions. After that, he tried the Charlottetown Accord, and of course that ended after a Canada-wide referendum in 1992. And so, nothing came out of that. Section 35 really wasn't resolved, and then the court started to interpret it with the Sparrow case in 1990, and they handed down a number of cases affecting Aboriginal rights and treaty rights. In terms of Section 35, they've laid out legal tests for any time a group asserts an Aboriginal right or a treaty right under Section 35. And to meet those legal tests, to collect the evidence, and to sustain constitutional arguments in court cost millions and millions of dollars. And most communities, First Nations can't afford that. And so the government's been taking advantage of that, the fact that most of the communities are in poverty. And what they've done, is develop these policies for negotiation. And when Chrétien got into power, he had a majority government in 1993. In 1995, Chrétien, the guy who was behind the white paper, introduced a 1995 Aboriginal self-government policy. And they call it the inherent right policy, but it's anything but inherent right, because what that policy does is it says what's on the table and what's not on the table for negotiating self-government. They're basically saying, okay, all you Indians are in the Indian Act. If you want out of the Indian Act, then you have to negotiate your way out through this self-government policy. And the terms of the self-government policy are all matters of national interest are off the table. That means all federal powers. So all powers related to trade and commerce really are not to be shared with First Nations. Canada's keeping that for themselves. And for provincial areas of provincial jurisdiction, the provinces have a veto. For example, I noticed you guys were negotiating a self-government agreement before your council for child welfare. Well, the way that policy works is whether it's sectoral agreements like child welfare or education or health or whatever, or a whole self-government agreement covering all of that, any areas that go into the provincial government's area of jurisdiction, they have a veto over it. In other words, if they don't like how far you're going in asserting that you have some authority, they could say, no, we don't agree with that. And the federal government wouldn't agree. And that's why the federal government's always saying you have to have minimum standards, and by that, in the contribution agreements, and by that they mean provincial standards, no matter what area it is, education or child welfare or whatever. Because during the Constitution, the talks in the 80s, what was being talked about was a First Nations order of government as a distinct order of government with recognized territories and jurisdiction. Well, that didn't happen. So what they're trying to do now is say, okay, we already have federal powers and provincial powers in the Constitution. And what they're trying to do is turn, using that self-government policy, they're trying to get, before 1982, according to Canadian law, they could unilaterally extinguish Aboriginal and treaty rights. But since 1982, they need Indian consent. So that's how come they're coming up with these policies of negotiation, is to try and get First Nations to self-terminate under these policies. Now, the self-government one has been there since 1995, but they've also had the specific claims policy and the comprehensive claims policy since 1973. And the comprehensive claims policy is a land claims policy for areas where historic treaties haven't been made, like British Columbia, Quebec, Atlantic, parts of Ontario. I know Lubicon was saying they weren't covered under Treaty 8, so they were arguing Aboriginal title in their territory. And specific claims are for areas, they're lawful obligations, which usually include treaties, breaches of treaties or reserve lands or trust funds. And of course, if you get a settlement, a specific claims settlement, you have to extinguish any other claims you have against the government in accepting that money. So there is extinguishment involved in specific claims, and in comprehensive claims, you have to agree to extinguish your Aboriginal title in exchange for a modern treaty. So between the self-government policy and the land claims policies, it's all about extinguishment or terminating your rights in the long run. And there's 92 tables. I said there was 93 tables in my article, but I've since seen a community notice to the Blood Tribe saying they wrote a letter to Aboriginal Affairs asking to be taken off the list because they're no longer pursuing the self-government agreement. So there's 92 tables now instead of 93. And there's a list on the Aboriginal Affairs website, so you can see province by province which tables are there. And, with the Harper government coming into power, from Chrétien, I left off with the 1990s in Chrétien and the 1995 self-government policy. The other thing he tried to do was amend the Indian Act in 1996 and 97. And I was working for Ovid McCurdy at AFN at the time. I was the Indian Act Amendments coordinator. So it was my job to study the amendments to see if it was better or worse than the status quo. And I had, of course, technical people assisting me, lawyers and also other policy people. And we did an analysis, and our report to the chiefs was that the proposed amendment package was worse than the status quo, and we recommended the chiefs oppose it. And they went through it, and they took our advice, and it was Ron Irwin who was the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, under Jean Chrétien as Prime Minister. And we fought that legislation, and we beat them. In the end, they called it the Indian Act Optional Modification Act. And, most of it was developed by the bureaucrats within Indian Affairs. They were the ones that put in all the amendments that they wanted to better control and manage Indians, from Ottawa. So, we had reasons as to why we opposed it. Those were the main ones, was that it was going to bring more control, not less control. And so they called the election, and that died on the order paper. But then in 2000, Chrétien had, also the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples came down in 1996. Chrétien said they were already doing the things recommended in the Royal Commission's report. And, they had recommended $10 billion more in spending for 10 years, and Chrétien said that was too much money. So they just shelved that Royal Commission report and didn't do anything about it. But then in 2000, he replaced his Minister of Indian Affairs, I think it was Jane Stewart, and then he replaced her with Bob Nault. And Bob Nault came in, and he started trying to pass what was called the First Nations Governance Act, which really was repackaging of the Indian Act Amendments package that Ron Irwin tried to push in 96 and 97. But again, it was a way of trying to create national standards of control over First Nations in terms of governance and administration. So again, I was involved in an AFN implementation committee with leaders and technicians, and we fought that legislation too, and we wound up beating that again. The time ran out on it, but also Paul Martin had spoken up about it, and that helped us defeat it because, Chrétien kind of backed off a bit then.